A player revolt is brewing over New Zealand Rugby's exclusion of a Pacific Islands team for next year's Super Rugby competition. The 2021 edition will again comprise of 5 New Zealand teams, with NZR chairman Brent Impey saying none of the Pacific bids were viable for next year's contest. That's despite Aayden Clarke of the Pacific Rugby Players Association believing the bids ticked all the boxes.
We thought that a number of the organisations who were putting their hand up for this opportunity had some really great strengths and thought that they were good enough to be on the field in 2021, but obviously New Zealand Rugby disagreed.
And the Pacific players aren't the only ones upset. Joining me now live is New Zealand Rugby Players Association Chief Executive Rob Nichol. Rob, what are the players thinking of this, and were they even consulted?
Yeah, afternoon, Lisa. Look, when it comes to competitions in New Zealand, the Players Association and New Zealand Rugby have to actually agree them. And I guess the frustration we have is that New Zealand have kind of prematurely closed that process off by saying that actually we're going to do this, which is the 5-team Super Rugby Aotearoa. Now, we've got nothing wrong with New Zealand Rugby saying this is our preference after going through their bid process. But we have done our own work on the possibilities for next year, and we think with COVID restrictions and the way the world is and the fact that Pacifica have missed out for 26 years, we're in a unique position to really do something right here, which is to look at a 6-team competition next year that includes a Pacifica team. And we've done some work separate to New Zealand Rugby, albeit we've consulted with them around a feasibility study on how that can work and a plan for next year. And you know, what we're saying to them is, sure, you can have your preferred option, but don't close off the opportunities for spending the next 3 to 4 weeks around the table with us and the Pacifica. This is the wider Pacifica community who make up the group we've been working with, on seeing if we can exhaust all possibilities around making this happen, because frankly, it's time. It's time. If not now, then when?
Have you been consulted properly? Have they met their obligations?
Well, no, yeah, we've been consulting throughout, but we've actually got an obligation to agree. So to make that very clear,
so you don't
we have to agree competition. We haven't got a point where we're agreeing or disagreeing. All we're saying is, why would you take a premature decision when you haven't reached agreement with us yet?
Can you force their hand, Rob, and make this happen?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you've got processes like mediation and all that sort of stuff, and we still have to sit around and sign a document. So, you know, we're going to be in a conversation. We were just a bit caught out yesterday in that they were so firm on this is what we're doing. It's like, whoa, you've actually got to talk to us about that. And we respect the fact that we've got an option of a 5-team comp, but there are a whole lot of subtle advantages of a 6-team comp that we want to make sure we've exhausted, the opportunity to have a look at. And that's what we're asking for.
So is NZR trying to steamroll you? Do they think they know best and their decision is the decision?
Well, I think that's how we're feeling. Yeah, you know, and that's the frustration, I guess, is we're saying, hey, hang on a sec, you shouldn't treat your partners like this. It's about relationships in this time of COVID. It's only rugby, to be fair. It's not so many people are going through bigger challenges than this. But it's just interesting how people act and behave. And we're saying, actually, you want to strengthen partnerships, whether it's with your own player association, Australian Rugby, South Africa, whoever it might be. And we've just seen a dangerous trend this year where they seem to be struggling in that space, and now they're struggling with us, and that's not a good thing. So we want to get things back on track, and all we're saying to them is, we know you've got a preference for a 5-team. That's got some challenges. You've got to have a bye every weekend. It's got a huge injury rate. It's a tough comp. The guys love playing it, but they can't sustain it because they don't get enough breaks.
So
Whereas
how would you characterise...
You can.
How would you characterise New Zealand Rugby's approach to the players and their concerns and the way you are being treated?
Well, I think they're disrespectful of our relationship and agreements, and I don't, that's disappointing from our perspective. But to be perfectly honest, we're big boys, and girls, we can handle that, no problems whatsoever. The one that we're most concerned about is the Pacifica community. You know, there are the legends of the game. 40% of our Super Rugby players are Pacifica. 50% of the current All Blacks squad is Pacifica. You know, they've been such a massive contribution to rugby in the Southern Hemisphere and all over the world. 25 years ago, they missed out on the team. They don't have a professional Super Rugby team underpinning their national teams. Their national teams are struggling. If we don't do something soon, they may very well not be here. We've got an opportunity to do something. So if we can, why don't we exhaust every opportunity to try and do it this year? The promises of 22 are fine, but no one knows what's happening in 22. We can control what we do next year. And we just want to work hard on that with New Zealand Rugby over the next 3 to 4 weeks, see if we can deliver something.
Is it racism, Rob?
No, not at all. I think we've actually got ourselves a little bit tied up in a whole lot of reasons why we can't do something. The money, the stress of things, the need for certainty immediately. In times of uncertainty, people were really keen to get certainty, but actually sometimes you just got to keep a cool head and make sure you've got scenarios, make sure you've got options. And that's the other thing here. This 5-team comp kind of relies on a cross-border with Australia next year. Well, the Warriors are going over to Australia to play their whole competition. They're not relying on flying back and forwards each weekend. So we're not so sure how possible that cross-border is. A 6-team competition, Lisa, produces 33 games versus 21 games on a 5-team comp. You can put the buys where you want, and they can rotate the squads when they play the new team, so to speak, or the team that we would stand up for next year. So there's some other subtle advantages that just, I suppose, provide more certainty for the broadcaster, for the fans, for the teams and the players that are playing in it, where we can sustain this competition by ourselves. We don't need to be able to play cross-border. And
Rob,
so there's little things like that need to be looked at. And we're just saying, give us the opportunity. Don't close your mind off. Keep your mind open for another 3 weeks.
speaking of Australia and the border, Rob, this idea that the All Blacks could be in quarantine for Christmas, Brent Impey says New Zealand Rugby didn't agree to that last game on the 12th of December. Have you seen proof of that? Do you believe that is true?
Oh, wow. It's another relationship thing at SANZAR level, isn't it? But look, to be honest, we've seen a lot of correspondence, and all of that correspondence confirms to us that New Zealand did not agree to the draw that shows 12th of December. And that actually they were quite clear prior to the announcement in particular that they didn't agree to it. So, but from a player's perspective, we've taken a pretty big breath around this, that, they are so appreciative and grateful for the fact that they're going to be up and playing international rugby, the first country in the world, basically, to do that. So they've decided, and we're communicating this now, that the focus of the team is going to be on preparing for these 2 tests in New Zealand. And then once they finish those 2 tests, they will all be getting on a plane, absolutely going to Australia, and hopefully knocking it out of the park at Rugby Championship. The issue of the draw is something that New Zealand Rugby need to work with SANZAR and fix. We've put that on their shoulders and asked them to go and do their best to come up with a solution. Once they have a solution, they will no doubt come back and show that to us, hopefully.
Okay.
But the players have had enough of it. They've said, actually, we're here for the rugby. That's what we're focusing on.
We know now that there's a one-way travel bubble that's being set up, right? So going into Australia, certain places you won't have to go into quarantine. Could that potentially aid you getting to a resolution here? Because when the players arrive in Australia, depending on how open it is there, you might not have to quarantine at that end. Could they pull things forward a bit?
Yeah, well, they're one of the options on the table, and there are a few, and we've certainly written to New Zealand Rugby, and they've circulated our thoughts to SANZAR, and we kind of articulated and kind of brought it back to the people, and the keenness for us to see everyone working together at these times. This pandemic's a tough thing, and we want these relationships to be strong. Australia has got so many assets when it comes to rugby. They've got a wonderful, wonderful legacy, and so we're kind of saying, hey, you can work this out, but that could well lead to a solution, Lisa, and let's hope it does.
Rob, if there's no solution, are the players going to boycott if they are forced to go into quarantine for Christmas? Are you going to dig your toes in and say, no way, not doing it?
The feeling I'm getting is that it's just not something that sits comfortable with the All Blacks or the All Black legacy. I've been doing this for 20-something years, and we always have a great faith that if people get around the table and work together, you can solve pretty much any problem. And so that's the focus, and that's the message we're giving to New Zealand Rugby and SANZAR, is get around the table, guys, and solve this problem. And ultimately, if they can't solve the problem, then maybe we've got to step up and do something we don't necessarily want to do. But at the end of the day, there are some solutions there, and that's the key point. So we'll let the administration do their job and try and solve it. And ultimately, if they come back and say, listen, we've worked really hard and we need you to do this, then we will consider it and say, how best can we deliver?
Appreciate your time this evening. That is Rob Nichol, who is New Zealand Rugby Players Association Chief Executive.